So my name is Gabby Hewitt. See a lot of familiar faces in the chat. So again, really excited to have you. I work with Justin here at Education Elements. And like many of you, we've spent pretty much the last few months thinking about how can we take our processes that existed in our formal structures and sort of tweak them for the new normal. And one of those is around this idea of building a culture of belonging. So that's really what we're excited to chat with you about today. Justin, not sure if you want to say hi.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Justin DeLeon. Been with Ed Elements for a while now. Taught in Miami, where I live, and also in the Bay Area in San Jose. It's good to see everybody here. And one thing, like as a teacher, that I valued greatly at the schools I worked at was the belonging I felt, which is what kept me in the profession for a while. And as Gabby mentioned, we really had to adapt the way we think about that. And so we are hoping to give you some ideas and ways of thinking about creating a culture of belonging with the teachers you support.
Awesome. Thanks, Justin. And I forgot to mention, I know Justin's calling in from Florida. I'm calling in from Pittsburgh by way of DC and Louisiana. So some experience working in some of the areas that you guys are calling in from as well. All right, so I won't read this entire slide with you, but Justin and I have been chatting over the last few weeks about what we were hoping to pack into the hour that felt both meaningful, but also not overwhelming and very practical, meaning you could leave this session and have something that you could implement right away. And so you can see the objectives on the left, but want to just share, we're going to break up the hour in 3 parts. Justin's really going to sort of give us an idea of how we can think about belonging and what that might look like through the lens of a framework or some framing slides. I will share with you a case study. So one of our most recent and most explicit examples of how an organization built this culture of belonging and how we could actually apply that to our educational setting. And then we're also going to give you some practical strategies. So we're going to break down that case study and we're going to say, okay, this organization did this. Here is a strategy you could try if you would like to do the same thing. Okay. So we're hoping it feels like a good mix of sort of the feel good, this is what belonging is, but also like this is how you build it. And you leave walking away with one thing you want to test out. A few other things about our company. I think a lot of you have attended some of our sessions in the past. But we are coming up on our 10th anniversary and have reached, I want to say more states than that. I'm not going to quote a number, but I think we're closing in on 50 at some point. And so we've tried to use a lot of our learnings with districts that we've worked with across the country and bring those to some of the sessions that you'll see throughout our webinar series. So we're very proud of that. The other thing that you'll probably hear come up, not just in this webinar, but in other webinars that we put out, other collateral that we put out, is this idea of responsiveness. And we see this as the key lever whenever we're trying to transform any organization, school, district, team. And you can see how we think about that, right? We ask teachers to be responsive at the classroom level by being more student-centered. We ask leaders to do the same thing, right? Be more responsive to their staff and their team needs as well. And so you'll see some of the responsive leadership, responsive team factors come into play today. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Justin to talk about why this matters.
Thanks, Gabby. So as many of you are experiencing and seeing, unfortunately, in response to the pandemic, many more teachers are leaving the classroom. There was a survey done by NEA, and they found that 28% of teachers said the pandemic has made them more likely to leave or retire early. And that number looks different too, like depending on which age groups you're talking about. So even teachers with in their 21 to 30 age group, that's a higher percentage, around 40%, and teachers who've been in the profession around 30 years, that's closer to 55% who are considering leaving. And these are very difficult decisions for people. And there's no simple answer, as we all know, to figure out how to get teachers to stay. One thing we can consider, though, is how we are sensitive to and being intentional about creating belonging. It's not going to address all problems with burnout or stress, but when teachers feel a greater sense of belonging, they feel a shared identity with their school community, they're more likely to persevere and to stay. And so on that last slide, I talked about how people are leaving because of concerns over safety. the other reality is that there are many teachers of color that are leaving the classroom because of a lack of feeling belonging. And more districts have started to prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And it's very long overdue. People are starting to take it much more seriously. And a couple of years ago, or maybe a year ago, we had the woman you see in the picture, Dorita Blackman. She came and she did a session with the Education Elements team. And she shared quite a bit of perspective with us and how we think about diversity and inclusion. And she shared this quote: "Diversity is a fact, inclusion is a strategy, belonging is a measure, and equity is the goal." So we all aspire to have more equitable districts, more equitable schools, right, and places of learning. What we don't always consider and thinking about is the role of belonging and how critical belonging is in furthering our goals, right, and getting closer to equity. And so research also shows that people really don't feel belonging at work. In education, outside of education, this is not unique to teaching. You see it across many different sectors. There was a Deloitte study, and we'll share these slides afterwards, and you can read up more on this, but a Deloitte study found more than 3,000 people, that 61% of people cover or mask at work on at least like one dimension of their personality. So they're not comfortable bringing their whole selves to work because they don't feel a great sense of belonging. That number is even higher for employees who are Black or gay. And the cost of that is really great because you're not able to tap into people's full potential. Employees don't feel comfortable. And this applies to teachers as well, right? And we know that organizations where individuals have a great sense of belonging, they're a lot more engaged, right? They're a lot more energized by their work, their team, and they ultimately perform better. This notion, this idea of belonging and the impact it plays on the employee experience is also highlighted quite well in the research of Karen Twanerite. So she works with a company called EY Global Diversity and Inclusiveness. And she found that when people feel they belong at work, they're much more productive, motivated, and engaged, and 3 times more likely to contribute at their fullest potential. 3.5 times, sorry. So you can imagine, right, when we have teachers who don't feel a strong sense of belonging, that they're not their most effective selves, and they're not able to be their most authentic selves either. And so they're not able to bring their best selves to work and share their gifts with their students. And then coupled with that, the research that we just talked about, the role of belonging, we also have new constraints in place in many of the districts and many of the schools that you work in because of distance learning. So this graphic just breaks down what some of the opportunities and what some of the constraints are in a distance learning environment. You see that we have to focus on helping teachers meet basic safety needs and human needs. Do they have shelter? Do they have food? Do they have a safe place to sleep at night, right, in a home? With COVID, this introduces a whole nother slew of safety concerns as well, which is why a lot of people are leaving. As districts and schools get more control over that, then you begin to think more about belonging and identity. Without having a strong sense of belonging, any of your operational structures or the teaching and learning that happens in classrooms, it's not going to be the most effective and at its peak unless basic needs are met and unless teachers feel a strong sense of belonging and that they feel that their identity is shared in the school community. So that's really what we're focusing on today, as you're aware. But I just wanted to kind of situate belonging and identity into other aspects of schools and other aspects of teaching and learning. And then finally, there's an interesting tool here. This is also from EY, their belonging barometer. And what it looks at is what happens when people feel excluded and how exactly do people feel when they feel excluded. What's interesting is that looks different depending on when you were born and when the teacher was born. So when people feel excluded, people generally feel ignored. It does cause stress. It does cause loneliness and some anger. But the most pronounced statistic here, and this is like based on a survey, is feeling ignored, feeling like you're invisible. So again, if we're not sensitive to this, we're not getting the most out of the teachers, and we're not creating a place where they want to work and where they want to stay. But there are companies and there are teams who have been thinking about this quite a bit, and Gabby's going to walk us through a case study and an example of what that could look like.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. And I'm also, if you see me looking over, I have the chat on another screen, but I'm just looking at all the comments that are coming in, and this is one. It sounds like it's really hitting a nerve, but two, I think the theme that I'm noticing in every chat is COVID's not like creating a lack of belonging. It's just magnifying some problems that already existed and creating new challenges. And so we're hopeful that some of the strategies we share with you today would actually apply if we were together in person, but also in sort of our new environment of remote working. So want to share this case study. A few years ago, some members of Justin and our team, we were able to go to a conference on how organizations can become more responsive. And we were able to hear from a company that everybody probably knows by now, but Airbnb, right? International brand. The logo that you're looking at right now is Airbnb from the early 2000s, right? So if you've been around or listened to Airbnb, rented from them in the future, this is probably not the visual that you're used to. But the story that we were able to hear is how Airbnb actually shifted to this idea of belonging as their core value, right? A lot of organizations have mission statements, vision statements. Belonging became Airbnb's mission, vision, core value, right? And what they did is they took a hard look at what their current brand identity was in the early 2000s, right? So they said, you know, if someone were to ask what our business model is we provide like a platform for rental houses. That's it, right? And that use of the word house was very intentional, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. And in terms of their bottom line and research that they did to sort of create strategies to get there, a lot of research was around like, how do we make renting convenient? It wasn't anything else. It was just like, if I'm the customer who's looking for somewhere to stay, how do I make sure that this is the most convenient way possible, which is not a bad business model. And they were very successful in doing this. The data that they looked at was very quantitative, right? It was financial data. They used that to think about, you know, how can we drive accountability of our employees? How do we track progress? How do we measure it based on how many sales are coming out of a single person's portfolio? And in terms of bringing in diversity and inclusion, they did sort of what most organizations do, which is they provided some formal diversity training. And so again, nothing that we're sharing is negative, but what I love about this story is they had a really good business model, but they realized without belonging, they were taking care of customers in a way that they weren't taking care of their staff, and they were experiencing higher turnover. And so what they did in about the decade since, you know, those stats were sort of created, I would say 2012 is when they first started looking at belonging as a core value, is they started to analyze, well, what actually is the continuum of growth when it comes to this idea of feeling like you belong within an organization. And so you can see some of these circles, right? They actually start in the middle. And so whenever you join an organization, you automatically have a sense of belonging by virtue of being a team member, right? You get your email, you get your benefits, your name goes on the website, right? You have that sense of belonging because you are now physically part of this team. And so I think a lot of teachers, educators, leaders, this is sort of a given if they're a part of your organization, right? When we start getting more mature in feeling like we belong, this is when Airbnb sort of defined having this sense of manager belonging. And what they mean by that is someone, typically a superior, right? So someone who has a little bit more power within that organization, sees you and recognizes your contributions. They might have your back, right? But maybe that's where it flattens. It doesn't go anywhere past that, right? So my direct manager has my back. You know, we've worked with teachers before who are like, I know my principal has my back, or my grade level chair has my back. I don't know that my district does, though. I don't know that they understand what we have going on here, right? And so that might be where it sort of ends, that sense of belonging. This is where you find turnover happening if that leader changes, right? So if a grade level chair gets promoted to another position, if a principal leaves and goes somewhere else, this idea of manager belonging is no longer there, right? And so this is why it's important that that's not where we stop. The next layer is really around this idea of feeling like your contributions are respected and valued. And so I think we've seen memes, or we've heard of, someone taking someone else's idea that they just said in a meeting, sort of twisting the words a little bit, and then it gets validated, or there's some kind of credit given. And so this is what Airbnb sort of found when they were looking at belonging. They realized someone might feel like they're contributing, but they're not getting the credit for it, or they're contributing, but until a louder voice, a more powerful voice, a different voice shares it, that particular idea is not respected or valued. It requires something else. And so to achieve this level of belonging, someone has to feel like if they have an idea, it's respected, it's valued, they are able to contribute and shift their organization as a whole, not just in one-on-one conversations with individual people. And then the highest layer that we can possibly achieve is this idea of personal, or sometimes they refer to it as social connections. And so this is like when you walk into a room and you don't just see someone who looks like you, but that is a big piece of it, right? If we go back to diversity, it's very hard to be the spokesperson for people of color in a room. So it's hard to be the one person. So if I walk in a room and I see someone who looks like me, or I see someone who identifies in a similar fashion as me, for Justin and I, we're both parents with little ones. If we have people on our team that we could say, COVID's really hard having your kids at home and trying to work at the same time, right? Knowing that we have those social connections or personal connections in a professional setting leads to a much greater sense of belonging as well. And so I want to sort of overlay this with some other things that has now come out in the years since Airbnb did this study. But I do want to name one more thing, and that is that there's no leapfrogging this, right? You can't say, I have a sense of belonging because I'm part of the team, and all of a sudden I have these social or personal connections. We have to have someone who is in power, whether they're an advisor, a manager, someone we directly report to, that has our back. We have to feel like our contributions are valued and respected, and we have voice. And we have to feel like we're not the only person in the room that identifies in a certain way, right? And so all of these together are really the goal of creating that culture of belonging. So something that I do want to share, what Airbnb ended up doing is they partnered with the Stanford Design School. And again, Justin mentioned it, but all these slides link out to a lot of the research that we did to get to this place. And if you take those circles from Airbnb and you look at the dimensions of belonging that the Stanford Design School has put out in the last 2 years, you see that they're almost a perfect match, right? And so at the basic sense, when we have this sense of belonging, it's because we're being invited to join, we're being welcomed, right? This might be when you're offered a job, you get your onboarding week, your new hire letter, we're so excited to see you, you're invited and welcome to join the team, right? That knowing and accepting, that is when someone knows us, and not just as a person, but they also know, what are you passionate about? What do you want to get out of this job? What are some things that are going to make you excited to come to work every day, right? Like, so someone knowing that, participating and contributing is almost a perfect match to feeling respected and valued. And then that personal growth is related to the personal connections, right? So knowing that we're not just contributing to our organization, but our contributions and being a part of that organization are directly leading to us personally growing as professionals as well, right? And so we just really love thinking about this, because if you could break down belonging this way, it helps you do a couple things. One, you could probably do a quick self-audit and see where your team is. You could say, you could even do this on yourself. You could say, I feel invited and welcomed, but I don't feel like I can participate and contribute. So that's something that needs to happen at my organization for me to feel this sense of belonging, for me to feel like I want to stay. So I want to share how Airbnb used these dimensions, and then I'll show you sort of a side-by-side about what the early 2000s Airbnb was like and the pre-COVID Airbnb. This data is coming from last year. But what you're going to notice on the left-hand side, these are the exact same dimensions that we just shared with you. And then in the middle, this is what Airbnb sort of said, this is what it gives us, right? So these two columns are just a different orientation of what I just shared. And then I also want to share a little bit about how Airbnb did this. And what Justin and I have done is we've said, okay, and here's a strategy that you guys can do to sort of recreate the same thing. And so if you just read left to right, this idea of inviting and welcoming people, what Airbnb did was they had intentional invitations, right? Active hospitality, even down to the CEO saying, I would love to just have lunch with you and meet you and learn about you. And so he did that for the first 300 hires. Not only was he a part of every one of their interviews, but he also made it a point to meet them face to face in their first few months at the company. This idea of knowing and accepting, right? What the strategy they used is not just knowing what someone's passion was, knowing someone's why, but also showing that out, right? And so Justin is going to give a personal example in a little bit, but you know, I was really passionate about having more responsive leaders because I've been in situations where I was a direct report to responsive and non-responsive leaders. And so knowing, you know, someone at the company who had more power than me when I first joined Net Elements, knowing that when an opportunity came up to actually work on responsive leadership, they were like, Gabby, totally you. Like, this is something that you're passionate about. And so showing how they're known as sort of that second part that shouldn't be forgotten. For participating and contributing, thinking about authentic engagement, sharing how a voice makes the community better, but we added an asterisk here because sometimes this also means being willing to give critical feedback, right? And not having that culture of nice when it comes to giving feedback. We've talked about the feedback sandwich on previous webinars. You know, Justin, I really love that email you sent. It probably needed to be a little bit clearer, but great job, right? Like, I started with a praise. I gave them the feedback I actually wanted. I ended with a praise. This idea of knowing contributions are valued is sometimes going to come with having that mutual respect to give really critical feedback. And then that last thing we mentioned, what they did is they said, if we want people to personally grow and have these personal connections, we need them to see that being a part of this community makes our community better, but it also makes that person better for being a part of it too. So I'm going to show you a side-by-side and then hand it over to Justin to give us some practical strategies. On the left-hand side, this is, you know, what I shared with you about how Airbnb arrived at this need to create belonging. Again, they had a successful business model, but they didn't have high retention rates. And so this logo on the right-hand side is probably what most of us are more used to. But one of the biggest changes that they were really intentional about, and this is what happens when you get into the black hole of researching Airbnb, is this logo is called the Belo, for belonging. It comes from the Latin root word for belonging. But also they wanted to make it to where if you were to join Airbnb as a host, meaning you had a property that you were willing to rent to people, you actually were able to modify this Belo symbol however you wanted. So I can make it rainbow, I can make it LSU colors, I could do whatever I wanted, but something to show that I'm part of the community. And this isn't just a corporate logo, this is something for me too. And they were very, very intentional about changing their platform to say these aren't rental houses, these are rental homes with local hosts, right? Down to services like, you're not just going to rent the home, like there's also a host who's willing to show you where the locals hang out here. And so that was a big shift on their end. And they came to that from having their own staff members come up with some of these ideas. So again, leading to that feeling like your voice is valued and you can contribute. Instead of just conducting research on how to make renting convenient, they also were conducting research on what determined an individual's sense of belonging. So if we understand what makes someone tick, right? If we go back to how we can create this, then we can actually make that a part of our standard Airbnb packages. So maybe it's a personal email, not a stock email from a corporation, but a personal email from someone. Here's my phone number if you have any issues, right? Leveraging financial data, that shifted from not just the quantitative data, but the organizational data as well, down to them using what they called murmur surveys. A lot of organizations, including ours, call these pulse checks, right? So instead of just looking at surveys and financial data and seeing, where can we track someone's progress, we can also say, how are you feeling, right? Like what was good, what was a high from this week, what was a low? Here's an anonymous feedback form you can share with us if there's something on your mind that you want to be able to have a safe space to share. And so just sort of expanding their view of data to show success of the organization, to also look at some more qualitative data pieces. And then finally, they went away from just like check the box diversity training, right? It's not enough to just say we're going to prevent bias because everyone's going to do our 1 day of DEI workshop a year. But they also talked about how preventing biases is going to lead to direct shifts in people practices. And so instead of just saying we want to hire a diverse workforce. They actually had the hiring committee talk about, well, what are my own intentional biases? And I'm going to check my language when I'm talking about a potential candidate. I'm not going to say, well, Justin's not a good fit. I'm going to use actual evidence to try and eliminate my bias as much as possible. So having their diverse hiring practices be well equipped with strategies that are aligned to doing that. So that is a lot about Airbnb. I don't work for them, but I do love this story about how they sort of created this framework for belonging. And I also think some of the strategies that we share fit really nicely with some of these dimensions as well.
Well, if you did want to work for them, Gabby, I feel like they could find a home for you on the team. So I'm gonna share a couple of strategies with everybody today. A couple of things, like before I jump into this first one, the slides are pretty text heavy. That's on purpose. We wanted to make this like a referenceable guide, so you could go and use some of these strategies when we hang up and when we end this webinar. And then the second thing, Gabby mentioned this as well, but these are strategies that could be used virtually, and they could also be used if you're in person. So we selected and we kind of wrote about strategies that are a bit more flexible. And the first one we have here is the check-in question. Pretty much every time we share this with the group, we often hear, and I often hear, oh yeah, we start our meetings with check-in questions. We already do that. And then you observe the meeting and you notice that they might just start with some kind of informal banter or just catching up. And then they're like, okay, are we ready to start? It's not necessarily a formalized part or structure of the meeting. With the check-in, that is exactly what you're trying to do. So think of it as an item on the agenda. And all you're doing is you're putting a question at the top of the agenda. The facilitator asks each person to answer the question one at a time. The key thing is to not talk over anybody else. So each person speaks one at a time only, and you're not responding to each other. So that is a difference from how a lot of teams begin meetings, because they'll often respond or get excited. Why would you want to do this? Even though it's a pretty subtle move, the check-in question and bringing everybody to the table and to share their voice in the beginning of the meeting, it sets the tone that they're welcome to speak and that they're welcome to contribute during the remainder of the meeting. So it increases psychological safety. We're not going to get too much into psychological safety today, but that is a huge part of people being able to bring their whole selves to work. What we linked here too that you can use later, there's a really cool check-in question generator. So if you're looking for questions, you can make them silly, you can make them serious. We use them for any number of things. So for example, like if you just want to get to know people, you can ask about where would you go on vacation, or you want to get more personal, you see these examples on the right-hand side, right? If you could choose your age forever, what age would you choose and why? So something maybe deeper. This seems pretty simple, but like these questions and doing them week over week, you really learn a lot about your teammates. You really learn a lot of unexpected information about them. And that can raise all sorts of connections that you otherwise wouldn't have. And two people who might not otherwise talk to each other, maybe they would, right? So you can also modify this in a virtual setting or depending on time. So something we started to do at our company with Education Elements, we have shortened our all staff meetings to 30 minutes. We used to go around one at a time and check in. Now we just do simple things like emoji reactions in Zoom, or turn your camera on or off if you feel this way or that way. All right. We can go to the next. Oh, thanks, Gabby. So the next one here, this is kind of a sillier one, is synchronous movement. So you'll see me down in the bottom center there, raising the roof. We do like little silly things like this because synchronous movement, it really creates a subconscious connection when you're moving. It's not that you're moving around each other, you are moving at the same time with your peers. It's a very simple and like easy thing to do. You could do it on Zoom. You could do it obviously like in a meeting in person, and you can modify like air high fives or things like that. It seems kind of trivial and silly, but you also have to think about how different parts of the employee experience or the teacher experience add up. So what are all the different touch points? Like if I start a meeting with a check-in, and then at the end of the meeting, we have some synchronous movement, and during the meeting, I have a few times to talk, right? Or I lean into the meeting more because I was able to check in. All of those little kind of subtle touch points along the way, those all contribute to the experience that I have as a teacher. And they have the ability, right, to increase my sense of belonging. So again, like think of some of these strategies as how you might use a couple together, like in combination over a longer period of time. Each of these in and of themselves, they're not going to be game changers, but stringing them together, staying dedicated, right? And also just having conversations about belonging and even explaining why you're doing something like Mr. DeLeon's making us raise the roof again, right? Like give some context to why you're doing it and like help people understand. Okay, so this next one, this would require a bit more planning, but it really helps. Oh, and I forgot to mention, in the top right corner of the slides, you'll notice that we have the icon and from the framework that Gabby shared earlier, what level it contributes at. This is more of like a one-to-many alignment. I don't think it's exclusive to one part of the framework, but just to anchor it and help you understand how they connect back to the framework, we added those labels in the top right. So something that we practice in our company and specifically with our design and implementation team is we rotate meeting roles. And so what that means is, we have a facilitator, we have a note taker, we have a DJ, we have people who, are the overall owner of the meeting. We focus on a different core value each meeting. And it used to be where people had that role, the same people had that role every single week, right? So Gabby would always be the facilitator for half a year, right? Until the baton was passed to somebody else, which worked perfectly fine. What we've changed though in more recent times is rotating these meeting roles. And something I would point out about it too is even if you're brand new to the team, you're welcome to take on a role and you're welcome to facilitate the meeting. So you don't have to have like a bunch of years experience or this, that, or the other thing, because we're trying to bring more people to the table. And essentially like when we have more space for teachers to play an active role, bringing it to the school context, first of all, like they're going to learn more about facilitating meetings. So there's just like that hard skill to learn facilitating meetings with adults, driving decision-making, et cetera. But also you're exposing the staff to different voices and you're giving each teacher a chance to contribute. So if you think about a faculty meeting where as a principal or an AP or whatever your role is, it's always on you to plan the meeting, right? Think about if that was more of a distributed responsibility and more people could take ownership, right? And more people had a voice. You certainly could have somebody be a consistent player and like help coordinate, but this is a pretty simple way to distribute some of that leadership and also hear from more voices in the school. Another thing that you can consider is sharing personal stories or sharing your why. I'll do like a quick version for you all in a sec. But what we do, what we used to do a couple of years ago is we all took turns basically sharing why do we do what we do with education elements. We also often do this in workshops when we are starting a new project with a different group of teachers, especially like in classroom focused capacities. We share our why, or we ask somebody from the school or the district to do the same. The story that you see here, you're probably confused by why is there like chicken nuggets. But the simple answer is that when I was a kid growing up, I had this teacher, I was sharing this with Gabby recently, this English teacher named Mr. Gray. He was my creative writing teacher and he ran our Readers Writers Workshop. So he made it a point to visit with us, a couple times a week, check in on our writing. And I was really into it. I was very into comic books in middle school too. So I wrote this story about a chicken nugget that came to life and became a superhero. And Mr. Gray like encouraged me to submit it to my local newspaper for this contest, and I won, and like I never had any experience like that. And compare that to the experience I had in calculus when I was in high school. It was very rigid. It was very one size fits all. There was no one-on-one interaction with the teacher. There's no coaching. There's no differentiation. I had no choices. Everyone did the same thing at the same time in the same way. So I majored in English and became an English teacher. And it really, it's not all traced back to that one experience with Mr. Gray, but it certainly played a huge role. So that story I shared just there, it took 2 minutes. You know a lot more about me than you probably care to know. But if I was your teammate, right, and we worked in the school together, some of what I shared might spark something in you. It can give you something to reach out to me about, right? It can help you understand, oh, I love comic books too. And that's something we could nerd out about together, or whatever the case may be. So prioritizing that, and if you're a leader in your building or in your district, modeling that, right? And you could be vulnerable and share and help people understand that it's a safe place for them to be themselves and to share their stories. So it can be really powerful. Probably the most obvious is to ask. So I really mean that. Sit down with people and ask them, when do they feel like they belong? When do they feel like they don't belong? I don't know, I wouldn't recommend that you go and you do that out of the gate with a brand new teacher or somebody that you don't have the strongest relationship with, without practicing a few times, making sure you understand the conditions and the climate in your school. But it does make you can learn quite a bit, and it can really help you check some of your assumptions or some of what you're perceiving to be tensions, or if you're noticing that there are certain teachers who maybe aren't getting along, or you're noticing that some teachers seem to be isolated, or they haven't really found strong connections with others, this is something that you can consider doing. And going back to something Gabby shared earlier about the manager belonging, as a leader, this is a really simple gesture that you can do to sit down with one of your teachers or a group of teachers and have a frank conversation with them and show them that you value their perspective. And that can give you feedback to really improve the way that you're creating a culture of belonging and understanding what is making people feel like they're on the outside, like they can't plug in and really bring their whole selves to work. This last one is going to cost you a little bit of money. So it's really just buying lunch for people. It seems obvious. Some of you probably already do this, but you might not. And with some planning, right, if you were to set up a calendar, create some small groups of people, the trick is to cross-pollinate. Have people connect with others who they normally wouldn't talk to, right? So when I was teaching at a middle school here in Miami, I had my people in my wing. I was in classroom 174, right? I had Miss Laughlin right there. I had Mr. Lewis next to me. Those were my people because we're all right there. We looked out for each other. I was friendly with other people, but I didn't get a chance to really connect with them as much, right? We had a much bigger staff than 3, obviously, in a middle school with 2,000 students. So, but there was a couple times a year we'd have really nice events together as a staff. But there's all these wonderful people that I might not have had a chance to connect with and get to know or know what they're interested in, right? And again, it's simple things like this, and we all know breaking bread with our friends and people in our community, that's a very huge way we can facilitate some togetherness. And so this is something that we've also done several times with some of the school teams and districts that we work with, because we've had a few districts come to us and say, we've done some team building exercise, we've done this, we've done that. Can you help us think about other ways to get people to talk to each other and to help us address and remove some silos, because I want to energize this new initiative, right? This is something that you can do that's pretty simple, right? You could deliver food to people, have food delivered as well. And you can have people meet on Zoom if you guys are in a distance learning capacity, like many districts are. So something to consider. And again, what I want to reinforce is that none of these on their own is going to address any like lack of belonging that people are feeling or experiencing. It's about being dedicated to it. It's about putting together and assembling a number of different strategies and experimenting and trying different things. And I would very strongly encourage you to sit down with some of your teachers too and ask them what makes them feel like, what happens, what does it look like when they feel a sense of belonging, and the opposite as well, to raise your own empathy and raise your own awareness, because that could help really drive some of the decision-making around what else you decide to do.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. And I'm going to go a little bit off for a second, just because I really like what James shared in the chat, just around like seeing teacher morale and hopelessness right now. And I know we sort of glazed over this in the beginning, but the challenges that we have with belonging right now, or feeling isolated, are not because of COVID, right? Like there's some layers to that because of, you know, being now in these remote environments and not having that interpersonal connection anymore. But I think the other thing is it's magnifying some feelings of isolation that probably existed prior to that as well. So like I said, what we are hoping you could do is potentially do a mini audit of your own team, whatever team you want to sort of shape and create a greater culture of belonging. And I'm going to go back just a little bit, but if you think about these dimensions of belonging that Justin just gave us strategies for, it's helpful to try a check-in, but if your teammates already feel a sense of belonging, that's not what you need, right? It's not that that's not going to help add up to it, but you need that plus something else. And so I think it'll be helpful, and this just sort of goes back to what James was saying, it'll be helpful to think about what is causing that low morale, you know, what is the root cause of sort of the feelings of hopelessness, and what are the things that you can control and get a greater sense of. So we're going to move into a few closeout slides, but what we want to do is a couple things, right? One is actually see what's sticking and resonating with you right now and using a different feature than just the chat. But two, from a meta perspective, this is another way that you could create a sense of belonging if you have sort of large faculty meetings, staff meetings, team meetings over, you know, a virtual platform like Zoom. And so this is a free resource called Slido. You can integrate it into your Google Slides, which is the platform that we use for all of our presentations. And you can do it a couple of ways. One, you can just open up a new tab on your computer. You can grab your phone, open up a tab, and just go to slido.com and enter this code. The other thing you could do is you could take your iPhone's camera and just hold it up to that QR code in the left-hand side that you see. And it's going to actually open up this question for you, and it's going to ask you to share your response. And what we're going to be able to see in real time is your responses popping up. You will see big themes. It'll sort of work like a word cloud. The words that come up over and over again are going to be bigger. And then in the upper right-hand corner, you can see how many people have responded, right? If Slido is not working for whatever reason, you can also answer this question in the chat. So we just wanted to give you a minute to think about what's sticking with you right now. I see encouragement coming in the chat too. Looks like connection's getting a lot of love. Hope as well, which is good. Let's take maybe 20 more seconds if you wanted to answer either in the chat. Sounds like Unity and Empowered are coming in as well, or if you want to answer using this poll called Slido. Awesome. Seen is a big one. I love that one. Mm-hmm. I think that's across all layers of belonging too. Very cool. Awesome. Any final thoughts on belonging? If you have it as an attendee, you can just throw it into the chat. And Justin, also, any final thoughts on your end?
Well, Carrie shared space to vent, connect, and collaborate, but the venting piece, that's important. People are navigating, and each of us is navigating, and certainly our teachers, really difficult decisions, very stressful conditions. And just having space to open up about that and be heard is really important.
Yeah. Awesome. I love these answers. Okay. Well, you are going to get access to these slides. We're not done just yet. I do want to share a little bit about sort of what's upcoming, but I know the question around, are we getting these slides and recording, has come up a few times. So just know that we'll always send a follow-up email to these webinars, and that should land in your inbox tomorrow. But wanted to encourage you to join the conversation. We're pretty active on Twitter in terms of not only sharing out new resources that we come up with, but also hearing from you. We use a lot of different data points to see what's happening in education. This is one other way. So if you want to tweet any of your learnings, we always appreciate that. A lot of our resources that, we either shared, linked to the slides, or that we created are going to show up on our blog as well. So feel free to subscribe to that. And then I also want to share that we have a lot of opportunities to talk about webinars and different content, different topics, not just around belonging. But we're continuing that through the month of October. And so encourage you to check out our website. It's just @elements.com if you want to download any of those or sign up for any of them. And then there's a few virtual events that we have coming up. One of them we're really excited about is this distance learning road race. It benefits some organizations that we're working with on a nonprofit pro bono basis that are wholly sort of aligned to diversity, equity, inclusion, organizations that raise some of our more diverse populations and maybe underrepresented communities as well. And so we're really excited about those too. So feel free to join us for any of these virtual events, including this virtual race. All right. Part of belonging is knowing what people need, and I'm going to guess a lot of people need a Zoom break, and so we're going to give you maybe 10 minutes back. So enjoy your time back. We're so grateful you spent the last 50 minutes with us, and look for the email with this recording and the slides again. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate you being here with us.